Welcome everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Bishop Diane Jardine Bruce. I'm the Bishop Suffragan here in the Diocese of Los Angeles. Bishop Taylor, Canon McCarthy, who's our tech person today, and I are very glad that you were with us this morning. So there's some housekeeping notes for us all. I'd like to introduce Ada Ramirez, who will be our Spanish interpreter today. So Ada, would you please come on and give instruction regarding the interpretation?
Mm-hmm.
Ada, are you there? Okay, I can't hear Ada.
I think Ada needs to change channels.
Ada?
She can also put it in the chat.
Okay, Ada, put it in the chat. Okay, good. All right. So I'm going to thank Ada. I'm going to assume that's going to go in the chat. So please note, you should all be muted. While this is an introductory event to 3 topics, we won't be taking questions at this particular event. I'm going to ask Canon McCarthy to put up a slide right now that shows our future dates and where you can send questions or comments to. So that we want to know what questions you have as we go along so that we can answer your questions as we develop the next 3 events. So please take notes and email me your questions. My email address is up on the screen. And I know when you received your registration confirmation, it asked you to send questions to commonszoom@ladiocese.org. That was for the registration process only. Any questions or comments you have regarding the offering today should be emailed directly to me. So thank you for your understanding and your cooperation. And now I'd like to ask Connie Horniak to open us with a prayer.
The Lord be with you and also with you. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we ask your blessing on this gathering as we honor the uniqueness of diversity and as we learn more about the tragedy of oppression. Please help us to remember that discrimination has no place in our hearts and minds. We ask that you help us to broaden our empathy and understanding around culture and identity as we strive to increase our knowledge and confront our prejudices. Let us forever be mindful that we are all your children. We thank you for making us one in each other and one in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Connie. My friends in Christ, we are living in a time where we find ourselves once again at a crossroads. The pandemic has shaken us to the core. It's turned our world upside down. It's caused undeserved aggression against people of color. The pandemic has left many of us glued to our computers at home, watching social media and the news. It is in this context that we witness the brutal caught-on-video murder of George Floyd. George Floyd was not the first, but his death became a tipping point. As your Bishop Suffragan in charge of New Community Ministry, what we used to refer to as multicultural ministry, I invited our diocesan leaders in this ministry, Suzanne Edwards-Acton, John Limo, Mary Christ, Fenny Chang, Carlos Ruvalcaba, Peter Wang, Connie Horniak, Nick Griffith, Yane Kim, Aiden Ko, Brant Keenis, Gail Kawahara, and Kushnud Azariah to come together and to share how the pandemic and this escalation of prejudice and unrest is affecting them and the people among whom they live, work, and serve. After talking about their experiences, we know we had to do something. This offering today, and the 3 that will follow, is the new community's way of expressing and addressing the issues as we see and experience them. The group developed the title for the work they will be presenting to you today, and in the next 3 sessions, Trauma and Untruths, Promises Broken in God's Name. It is our hope and prayer that you will discover, starting today and over the next 3 sessions, why the group came up with this particular title for the corpus of the work. Today's event introduces 3 important topics: the Doctrine of Discovery, racial identity, and racial capitalism. It is our hope and prayer that you will come together again with us in the upcoming offerings, where each topic will be delved into in more detail. We'd also appreciate your talking about this and actively engaging these topics by inviting members of your congregations to join you at the upcoming events. This presentation, again, is being recorded and will be available on the diocesan website. You can point your friends to the page to catch up. Remind them that they can send their questions to me as well. Before I move on, I just want to give thanks for the Tongva and Chumash peoples, for this is the land that we are on today. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce you now to the Reverend Dr. Mary Christ, who oversees Indigenous ministry for us. In addition, Mary serves as coordinator for Indigenous theological education for the Episcopal Church. And the Reverend Dr. Fenny Chang, who is the convener for Chinese ministry, to walk us through an introduction to the Doctrine of Discovery.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Christ, and I welcome you today on behalf of the Native people I am representing. I want to explain why we're having this discussion from an Indigenous standpoint today. In 2009, the Episcopal Church, in a first of its kind action in the Christian world, passed a landmark resolution repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery and urging the U.S. government to endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Today, we're going to introduce the basics of this doctrine, its importance to us, and its effects that continue to foreshadow Indigenous people, not just in the United States, but around the world. It is the custom of most Indigenous people, when making a presentation of this nature, to introduce themselves and to identify their family members before making the presentation. Most of you know me as the priest at St. Michael's Riverside, but I am also an Indigenous Episcopalian, an enrolled member of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, and a staff member on the presiding bishop's team working as the coordinator of Indigenous theological education. I work with the Reverend Dr. Brad Hoff, Indigenous missioner for the Episcopal Church. And in the photo you can see Brad and some of my Indigenous sisters from the Talking Circle in Los Angeles, when Brad visited our Talking Circle ministry recently. It is also my pleasure to work with Indigenous people in the Diocese of Los Angeles, in Riverside County, Orange County, and in Los Angeles. Many of us don't realize there is an active group of Indigenous Episcopalians. In fact, we've been active for more than 400 years. We are somewhat invisible, but we are an active group and a growing group. Here is a photo of a group of our representatives from Episcopal groups all over the U.S. at our annual meeting, which is known as Winter Talk. It was held in 2020 in Seattle. And I wanted to show you also that we have young Indigenous Episcopalians. This is a group of representatives from the young people at a meeting held at St. Gabriel's Camp on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation last August. It's in North Dakota. The group that hosted all of us is led by the Reverend John Floberg and his wife, Deacon Sloan Floberg. And this is the New Star Lodge at St. Gabriel's Camp. This presentation is more than an academic presentation for me. Because when I talk about the doctrine of discovery, it necessarily involves my own family on my mother's side. We are enrolled members of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, and in our language we are called Amiskapi Pikani. In my naming ceremony, I was given the name Pitaki, which translates in English as Eagle Woman. My mother was Frances, a gifted school teacher, and the photo on the left shows my great-grandmother Florence, my grandmother Mary, her sisters Annie, Lavon, Grace, Norma, and Florence. My great-great-grandmother in the picture on the right was born in 1824, and she was named Mary Comes by Mistake. She lived 93 years. On my father's side, we are immigrants from Copenhagen, Denmark. My father was Paul Jensen, one of two sons of Albert and Marie, who settled eventually in Fresno, California. I am blessed to have been part of and continue to be part of a bicultural family. My people call this picture the backbone of Mother Earth. That's different from still simply calling these mountains the Rocky Mountains. This title of backbone of Mother Earth implies a deeper bonding with the earth that characterizes indigenous people who still have access to their land. We are connected to the Creator through this land. I'm showing you the land of the Amiskapi Pikani people in Montana. This is where my grandmother and my mother lived. We were given the name Blackfeet by the colonizers who noted the soot on the bottom of the moccasins from our campfires. We are called the Southern Robe Blackfeet because we are the southernmost nation in a confederacy of 4 nations. In Canada, our cousins are called the Blackfoot people. Our lands once included what is now known as Glacier National Park. Behind the guardians, which were constructed out of found objects by some artists on our reservation, you can see behind the guardians Chief Mountain. It is located on the northernmost part of our reservation on the border of Canada. Chief Mountain is where people go for spiritual purposes, to pray, to seek visions, to honor Creator. These guardians are found at the 4 main entrances to our reservation. Indigenous people are connected to our Creator through the land and the water. We were never taught that we could own the land, but that we were to care for the land because she is our mother. We believe all living things are connected to Creator and to one another by the life given to us. We do not see one group of people as better than another. And in the illustration, you can see the protests that took place a couple of years ago at Standing Rock Reservation, where the sacred water, which we know as life, was threatened. This is Glacier National Park. It was originally part of the Blackfeet lands, but by the 1870s, with the buffalo being killed off by outsiders, our people were in danger of starving. The Blackfeet leaders offered to lease the land from the government to the government, for $1 million, keeping their rights to hunting, gathering, and fishing on the land, and reserving it for public use. In other words, it was never to be developed. The US government agreed to this proposal because they thought there was gold and copper in these mountains. However, in the writing of the contract, the lease became a sale, and our people, the Blackfeet Nation, lost this land. Ultimately, federal laws were passed so that no one could live on the land or use it as a food source the way our people had done for centuries. Today, if we visit the park and show our tribal identification, we don't have to pay an admission fee. That is our only benefit remaining for land that was originally Blackfeet living and hunting property. Despite what you'll learn later on about the Doctrine of Discovery, which declared that the land was empty, terra nullius, this is a studio portrait taken in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1892. These are the Blackfeet chiefs who went to Pennsylvania to negotiate the lease of the land that we do know as Glacier National Park today. The deal was concluded in 1895. When I was at Glacier National Park a few years back, I discovered that all the concessions at the park are actually managed by the Japanese people because they got the contract to do so. Now, wait, we've said that the land cannot be owned. So what does this poster mean by sale of the land? This poster publicizes the beginning of the Oklahoma land rush in 1887. The passing of the Dawes Act in 1887 opened the way for the sale of Native American lands, prompting white settlement in Indian Territory. The now unassigned lands were considered the best public land in the United States. The passing of the Indian Appropriations Bill of 1889 allowed for 2 million acres to be opened for settlement. The land cleared by the passing of the Dawes Act was about to host the first Oklahoma land rush. An astounding 50,000 white settlers flooded the plains to stake their claim on the available 2 million acres of Native American lands. And you can see, if you look at the poster, that you could possess the land within 30 days, pay it off, and if you look closely, you can see that it tells you how many acres were available in the various states. And in the year 1911, it was estimated that 350,000 acres were to be offered for sale. So you see, this is one of the things that stems from the Doctrine of Discovery, which declared that the land was empty. Now, why were all of these Native American people thought to be invisible? Well, it was because they were not Christians. So let us move now a little bit further into just an intro to the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is a set of international law principles written in the 15th and 16th century, stemming from declarations made by the popes of the Roman Catholic Church. The legal precedent that still controls Native rights and affairs today is the Doctrine of Discovery. Based upon the theological foundation that Christian nations were exceptional, in other words, superior, and that non-Christians were subhuman, that is, without rights, the land was considered to be free for the taking by the colonializing nations that came here. In our future session, we will learn much more about the Doctrine of Discovery, more about what it is, where it came from, and why it is important, and how it traumatized Indigenous people for generations through enslavement and abuse of their basic human rights. You will discover, for example, something that most people know nothing about, the boarding school movement, and how children were taken from their families at the young ages of 4 and 5 and sent to boarding schools where assimilation education was conducted. Finally, we will also discover in September an ecological effect of the doctrine of discovery that is little known. The doctrine of this discovery actually led to the Little Ice Age, which took place in the 1600s. This was caused by a change in the percentage of carbon dioxide in the air. And the reason that change took place is because so many people died in North and South America, not just from directly being, murdered, but from illnesses and diseases. So many people died that the land that they had held under cultivation went back to its natural state. And when this happened, the plants caused the change in carbon dioxide, lowering the temperature and actually leading to the Little Ice Age. I have pictures, for example, of Philadelphia during this time, and it looks like the Little Ice Age, like an ice age, came to the city. In September, I want you to know we will also have a lot of discussion of reconciliation and how we can move forward. For example, as an Indigenous Episcopalian, I've had people say to me, well, if all of this happened, how could you possibly be a Christian? Well, I'm a Christian because I follow Jesus. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means. The doctrine of discovery is foundational to the systemic racism and broken relations experienced by Indigenous people globally today. Yet there remains the possibility, as I mentioned, for justice and reconciliation. How do Indigenous Christians make sense of the genocide they have experienced? What are today's Christians called to do to build the beloved community? These are the theological challenges and exciting possibilities that we face today. Just to show you another example of Indigenous Episcopalians, the photo I'm showing you is of Episcopal clergy and lay leaders at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Fort Defiance, Arizona, during presiding Bishop Curry's visit in 2018. This Navajo land area mission was initiated in 1978, consolidating what had been parts of the Diocese of Arizona, Rio Grande, and Utah. Today, there are many, many people in Navajo land suffering from the COVID virus, and many, many others, Episcopalians around the country, sending goods and services to them. What would Jesus have us consider today regarding genocide and systemic racism? I would like to share some of my own attempts to make sense of this situation. I want us to remember the Great Commission to carry the good news to people throughout the world in Matthew 28. We're all commissioned to share the good news of Jesus with those that we meet. I want us to remember that the greatest commandment to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself came from our Lord. And I also want us to remember that we should never take the Great Commission into the world without the greatest commandment going along. The Great Commission without the Great Commandment to love God and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves is a mandate that can and has led to genocide. I want us to remember also that Indigenous people are strong and resilient. We have survived racism, neglect, genocide, and paternalism. We are also curious, intelligent people. It is recorded that Emigabo, who became the first Indigenous Episcopal priest in 1867, pleaded for an Episcopal missionary to come to Minnesota Territory. Rising Sun, a Chippewa, also petitioned to the Episcopal Church for 15 years to get a missionary to come to his land. You see, we welcomed missionaries many times because we recognized that the white man's education was necessary for survival and for literacy in English, if not for salvation. So we want to keep this in mind, and we will talk a lot more in September about the theology that we need to consider when we're talking about reconciliation. Our people are still here. We're still here. We're seeking justice and reconciliation. I shared with you this piece of art done by a Blackfeet artist named Terrence Gardepee. It's called ledger art. It's what the artists drew on when they didn't have paper. They drew on ledgers that they found in the agencies where the Bureau of Indian Affairs had set up their work. I think you can see in the glorious colors the vivacious energy of Black people today, as well as all other Indigenous people who are still here, still raising families, many of us Christians, and many of us still wanting to work together with other people for justice and reconciliation, not just for ourselves, but for all people. Well, we're at the end of our time today, and I do invite you to join us again in September, on the 26th of September, when we will have more time to investigate and discuss the Doctrine of Discoveries, and we'll have more time and more ways to think about how we can respond to it today. I appreciate very much your being here, and thank you for listening, and see you hopefully in September. Bye now.
Thank you, Mary, for your sharing, for the summary of the Doctrine of Discovery. And we will share more with you in September, including how DOD impacted the indigenous people in Taiwan, my home country, and other parts of Asia. And now I would like to invite Erica Christian Berlin, a member of the Gathering, a Space for Asian American Spirituality, and Canon Suzanne Edward Acton, co-chair of the program group on Black ministries, to introduce you to the topic, racial identity, with help from the Reverend John Limo, co-chair of the program group on Black ministry, the Reverend Carlo Ruvabaca, chair of the program group of Hispanic ministry, and Dr. Gail Kawahara, convener for Japanese ministry. Let's welcome them.
Good morning, and thank you for being here, and thank you for all being willing to bear witness to the experiences of those who will be speaking today. As we've been saying, this is an introductory to much larger topics, and they deserve all the time that is there to unpack these very complex and sometimes very messy topics, because as humans, that is how we are. Today, in this section, we'll be talking about racial identity, and it is just an introduction, as it is something that is very personal and also can be very complex. So hopefully today, you'll be able to have a better understanding of race and racial identity, because those topics are very different concepts. And there are many established frameworks about racial identity, and we'll be going through some of those quickly, as well as the fact that we would like to connect the idea of racial identity to what we feel is in some ways our own church's racial identity framework, in that we wish to become beloved community. While we are speaking, and also while all presenters are presenting today, please be sure that you are aware of where you are right now, where you are as an embodied person sitting in front of your screen, and understand that you will have feelings, you will have sensations as you learn about topics that have brought pain to beloved people, that have brought empowerment to beloved people. Honor those feelings, honor those sensations in your created self, because it will allow you to learn in a much more deep and important way. So what is race after all? Many of you may be thinking, well, race is not actually real. Have you heard that before? It's because it's actually true. Race has no biological basis. However, it has a lot of social impact. So race itself may not be real, but the impact of race is incredibly real. And in fact, is something that underscores almost every part of our life. So race is very consequential, and societies use it to establish and to justify systems of power, systems of privilege, of disenfranchisement, of oppression, as we have just heard. Now, the dictionary's definition of race is, I would say, rather incomplete. It misses the complexity of the impact of lived experiences, and that is what we wish to talk about most today. So it's important to acknowledge that race is a social fabrication, and it is created to classify people on an arbitrary basis of skin color, physical features. And I say arbitrary because your skin color, your physical features may not always be readily apparent to what you racially identify as. And we're going to talk about more about that in a moment. So racial identity is both internal and external. And it talks about how our identities and our experiences have been shaped by race. On the basis of our racial identity, we are awarded certain privileges and or disadvantages, whether or not we're conscious of it. So whether or not you are aware of your own racial identity right now, you've got one. Everyone is assigned one. Usually first, it is externally imposed, how others perceive you, how others see you, how others treat you based on their internal biases and their external actions based on what they think your racial identity is. The work that we need to do for ourselves and the work that we do that helps us better also understand, address, and repair racial injustice is internally constructed. How do I identify myself? How do you identify yourself? How can I respect, understand, and help you grow in how you identify yourself? So the big why for why we do this work, for why we should do the work of racial identity formation, is not only that it is honoring God, our creator, who created us this way, beloved, and in this body, with these thoughts, with these identities within us, all within us. But also because this builds trust with others. It builds empathy with others. And without that relational trust and relational empathy, there is really no road to healing and justice. And so that is why we ask you to be comfortable in the discomfort of learning about these things, of hearing about these things, of accepting that these things, these lived experiences of folks are true, right? So we will be using on October 3rd, this handout, which we want to deliver to you now. Now, you're not necessarily expected to read through all of this right now, but we want to show you what it looks like. We're using this particular PDF, which is being delivered to you in the chat box. It's a clickable link, and you can, it's virus-free. It comes from Racial Equity Tools, which is an extremely well-established and wonderful resource for many, many materials. We're choosing this also because we know our audience is diverse. We have people of multiples of racial identities within our audience, within our diocese. And so we would like to have something that all can find themselves in. Now, what is racial identity development framework? So many sociologists and psychologists have identified that there are very similar patterns that every individual goes through when you begin the work of recognizing your racial identity. Now, I want to have a caveat here. I know it says summary of stages, and the word stage is used in this particular handout because of the date on it. The fact is that almost all, including one of the most stands the test of time racial identity schemas, which is the white racial identity model by Janet Helms, who is a pioneering Black woman who did much work in racial identity formation. We now like to use the word stages, or I'm sorry, not stages, but schemas, because status or schema makes it more obvious that this is not a linear process. So it's very easy to fall into the idea that this is a linear process with an end, like we've made it, we've got our identity now. It is never like that. You can actually, it's much more fluid than that, and you can actually have a continual evolution of your racial identity. In fact, if you are developing in a healthy way and you are intentionally choosing to do the work, you should think of these categories as like stations along a journey of that evolution of your racial identity. And many things play into this: your personal experiences, your family, your community, your workplace, your aging process, political events, social events, your journey of faith. All of these help us to move between desires to fit in to dominant norms, to questioning our own identity, and then even questioning in a healthy way the identities of others. Now, these questions will create confusion. They will create introspection. They will create feelings of discomfort. Anytime we are asked to think about things that are deeply accessed within us, that we never really think about on a rational or explicit level, that creates feelings many times of discomfort. And so that is why we say, be comfortable in the discomfort. And this is also where the faith that we have, that this journey that we are on, we are not alone on. Not only do we have our beloved community, but we are also doing this as created beloved beings, is an important thing to always keep front and center when we are doing this work. You'll see at the top there are 3 different categories. People of color will take you through various frameworks by various scholars about various identities of people of color. We have several models that affirm the experience of those of us who are multiracial, and then there is the Helms model of white racial identity. Again, I recognize that there are limitations on understanding because no race is a monolith, right? Not all people of color are in the same schema. Not all white people are in the same schema. Now, in that PDF handout, if you are looking at it already, you'll see that towards the end, there is an integrated model of identity development. And this was developed by John and Joy Hoffman, and they're an interracial couple. They have lifelong work in multicultural student affairs. So they're working with young people ages 18 to 25, which is generally when racial identity development does start. Whether or not the work is done is another question. And so what I want to do is talk you through that using this graphic very quickly, because again, this is just introductory and we do have limited time. So if you take a look at this integrated model, you'll see that the first schema here of conformity is the same, whether you identify as a person of color or as if you identify as white. It's called conformity because the phrase associated with this is saying, I'm just a regular person. This is where you may not be so aware of that you even have a racial identity. Now, I'm going to go through people of color first, and then I'll come back to white people, all right? So the next schema here we have is dissonance. We call it post-encounter as well. It means something's happened that makes you aware of that racial identity. And the phrase here would be, I'm confused and a bit frustrated. You're not sure what to do with this new information you may or may not have about understanding you have a racial identity and people treat you a certain way because of it. The next schema is called immersion, or I like to call it fight or flight. And this is when there are a lot of discomfort. There's a lot of feelings that are difficult to handle. And this is where the phrase would be, I'm so angry, I hate racists. and you hear the passion in my voice, and many times this comes out, this is where we have that angry zealotry, that wanting to do something that, and there is a lot of anger for what has happened to you when you realize as a person of color how much systems of whiteness and white supremacy has injured you, has oppressed you, has sought to destroy things in your life that you love and people you love. The next schema here is called immersion. Immersion is coming out. So immersion going in, immersion is a fancy way of, or I should say a more academic way of saying coming out. I also like to call this angry energy. And so there's still a lot of passion and a lot of, and I'm not saying angry in a negative way. Anger is energy, as Audre Lorde, another very groundbreaking Black feminist writer, has said. Anger is energy, and it can be used in a way that brings us towards justice, that brings us towards reconciliation, that brings us towards making things right, repairing the breach. So make sure that we're clear on that. Anger is not said in a negative way here. And that anger is that angry energy is like, I am because we are. And it is when you start to understand you belong to a group. You have this passion around identifying with your tribe, as it were, with your group, with your people, with the ones who are like you, who understand you, that you have a shorthand with. And there's a feeling of belonging that comes with that, that can be also very healing and also very peaceful. Together with that passion and anger, they coexist. It is both and, all right? And then we have the schema of internalization, or defining yourself. And the I am because we are becomes more I am whom I say I am. And this is where you begin to own that racial identity in an individual and empowered way. Now, this last schema here that we see, integrative awareness, you notice it is the same as well for white people. And integrative awareness can be described as saying, there's more to me than what you see. And it is that autonomy, that valuing of diversity, including your own, that positive identification with your own created being. Now, let me take you quickly through the white schemas, and this is also, you will find that again in that handout that you have. This schema here of acceptance is sort of it's dismissive in the sense that it's like, well, that's just the way things are. When you become aware again, after an encounter, that there is such a thing as race and racial identity. And if you are a person who is white, then there is a feeling of wanting to say, well, that's the way things are. But what that really means is you're saying white is right. White is normative. White is the way that it should be. And to be honest, that is why this first schema here of conformity is exactly that. White is the standard of normalcy. White is the standard of what is okay and positive. And that is what white supremacy has done as part of the bedrock of America's culture. It's that it has made whiteness something that is seen as simply individual, normal, and all right. Now, once a white person continues to do the work of forming that racial identity, they may come to this schema, which is called resistance. It's to protect you from anxiety, quite honestly. And the phrase here is, well, racism isn't a problem anymore. Or, but MLK marched and we're okay now. We integrated schools, we're okay now. We have affirmative action, we're okay now. This can also come out in conversations about this, saying, why do you always make it about race? Or you're playing the race card. That is what this schema is about. And if you are doing the work, however, as a white person, hopefully we'll get to this schema more quickly, which is, it says here retreat, but I like to think of it more as an intellectual, a cognitive acceptance of the reality of race, racial identity, racism, and systems of whiteness. And that intellectual acceptance can cause you to feel ashamed and guilty. Now, guilt and shame are feelings, and it's important to know what we do with those feelings. That's why I was saying it is important to notice, to accept, to honor the feelings that you have within yourself when we do this work, when we talk about these things. Holding those things without judgment or goal is important, because if instead of saying, I feel guilty and simply staying there, you can say, I feel responsible. If we say, I feel responsible instead of I feel ashamed, then action can come from that. Now, the next schema here of emergence, again, emergence like immersion, it's kind of the same idea, is that this is sort of where action really becomes important. And so as we reach this schema as white people, when we understand what white privilege is, when we understand what racism has done, what we understand what racism is doing, there is this, again, that, remember the passion, the energy that was here in the people of color model? This is where we're finding it here, which is sort of a crusading feeling of, I'm understanding my privilege and I want to do something. I want to do something now. And again, that passion, that anger, that push to want to do something is important. Honor it, harness it, let it guide you to action. Let it guide you to action within and externally. And so finally, again, we find ourselves at the schema of integrative awareness. Again, I want to emphasize, these are schemas or stations on the journey. You could go between these all in one day. To be honest, as somebody who is multiracial, and therefore I am both a person of color and I am both white all the time. I carry both these identities within me. I might be here on good days when I'm not so tired, when I'm well fed, when I've been doing my prayer and meditation, but maybe I'm hungry. Maybe I'm really, really too hot. I can slide right to another schema in a heartbeat when somebody does something that will trigger me. And so understanding that these are places of just understanding, giving names and vocabulary to the things that you are feeling and thinking about and doing as you go through this journey is important. So that positive identification with your created being is really, really key to becoming beloved community. When we can connect our acceptance of created beloved self with the acceptance of others' created beloved selves, then we find ourselves here. And we like to think of this in some ways as a racial identity framework, an identity framework for our church. And so we're going to invite others in our community to read through these to you. And this is available on the Episcopal website, and also if somebody would like to put it in chat, they can. So we'd like to go ahead and invite our readers to read these to you, and please think about these questions and ponder upon them as you hear them. John?
Telling the truth. Who are we? What things have we done and left undone regarding racial justice and healing?
Thank you. Gail? Gail, we can't hear you. For repairing the breach.
I'm sorry. Repairing the breach. What institutions and systems are broken? How will we participate in repair, restoration, and healing of people, institutions, and systems?
Please consider what is resonating with you right now as Suzanne reads Proclaiming the Dream.
How do we publicly acknowledge things done and left undone? What does beloved community look like in this place? What behaviors and commitments will foster reconciliation, justice, and healing?
What behaviors and commitments do you have? And finally, Carlos will read Practicing.
Practicing the way of love. How will we grow as reconcilers, healers, and justice bearers? How will we actively grow relationship across dividing walls and seek Christ in the other?
So, in service of seeing Christ in the other, like to invite our panelists to reflect on these questions about when were you first aware of your racial identity, and how is understanding where you are on your racial identity journey a spiritual practice for you? As you bear witness to them and their experiences, think of these questions as well and how you are engaging with them. We'll invite John to please go first. John, we can't hear you. Please unmute. Thank you.
As a young man born in a nation that was already invaded by colonialists, I identified my race as a very young man and was able to know that I am Black because the Blacks were not able to walk in certain streets and were not able to go into certain restaurants. And therefore, as a young man, I grew up knowing that I am Black and I am of a lesser position in the world.
Thank you. And how has this been a spiritual practice for you, understanding your racial identity?
Struggling hard to be able to know that I'm a child of God and being able to know that God created us the same. And God did not create us, biologically did not create us to be different. And so being spiritually, that has been my biggest struggle to understand what God really meant with creation and with putting us in this world. And so I will put some of those reflections in my last prayer.
Thank you. We bear witness to your experience. Gail.
I was aware of my racial identity probably since I can remember. I was pretty much prepped by the age of 4 or 5 to answer that question, what are you? And I was to say I'm Japanese American. An example of racial identity has sort of recently come up within the Japanese convocation. As we're talking about doing a workshop on racism, one of our leaders brought the fact up in regards to Black Lives Matter that Japanese Americans have been complicit with whites. And can we share how we have been racist? This was not a very comfortable conversation for everyone within our group, especially with Japanese immigrants who have not experienced what Japanese Americans have experienced. So there's some resistance to that. So this is very much a racial identity experience, and it teaches me and as a group that we're not all in the same place, and that we need to be mindful and prayerful of where we are with all individuals.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Sure. So as I thought about these two questions, it came back quickly to, as a light-skinned Black American child, I came to I was about 5. I remember someone called a member of my family white, and the tone that the person used was rather insulting. I could tell then that it was being used as an insult. So I asked the family member if it was true, and the family member said no, that it wasn't. I didn't really understand what all of it meant. I just knew that this interaction was happening, and that this thing was not true about me and about my family, that we were not white. And there began at this point a process of meaning making for me. And I was around the age of kindergarten when this happened. So I could just go on with many stories as I go through my life then, but this did start at kindergarten. And so, and then this connected for me to the question about spiritual practice, which is, I'm a trained spiritual director, and we hold spaces for people to ask this question, where is the divine in your life? And so as I thought about this, people who know me well, they know that I understand racism as an internalized dominance, as like a pathology, and as a spiritual crisis. I see it that way. And so the space that I hold, and a lot of you know that, is my work to do. And It's a space for white people, particularly for white people, to build stamina for conversations on race. And in that space, multiple times a week, I hear people who are in their 20s, their 40s, their 60s, their 80s, saying, white people saying, this is the first time that I've really ever thought about my race. This is the first time that I called myself white multiple times in one conversation or in one series. And this is the first time that I've deeply thought about what it means to be white. And so I reflect back into the first question, which is, for me, that started at around the age of kindergarten, and Gail kind of talked about that as well. Around that age is when this process of meaning making started. And so I create spaces. For me, my spiritual practice then is that I create spaces, sacred spaces, I hope them to be, for other people to really like dig deep into their own racial identity. That's what I see as my spiritual practice.
Thank you. And we witness this as well. And Carlos?
Carlos is having connection problems.
I see.
He's just had to restart his computer.
Okay. That is, well, hopefully we can hear more from him when we reconvene on October 3rd for a much more in-depth look at this very, very large topic of racial identity and how it is a way to lead us to becoming more beloved community.
And it's my honor to be able to introduce the next set of presenters. And I would like to invite or introduce the Reverend Dr. Peter Kong, Rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Santa Maria, the Reverend Nick Griffith, Rector of Christ Church, Redondo Beach, and the Reverend Dr. Peter Kong, Missioner for Asian American Ministries for the Diocese of Los Angeles. And they're going to be introducing us to the topic of racial capitalism.
Thank you, Canon Edwards-Acton. And good morning, everyone. So I'm going to start out with my presentation, and then Father Nick and Peter Kwong will offer comments in response. So good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be with you all today, and I'm actually so glad that I can participate in a new community ministry event. In the past, I'd see the announcements and advertisements about programs and events that sounded really great. But living way up here in Santa Maria, it just really wasn't feasible for me to drive down to LA and back in a day when it's 4 or 5 hours each way. So as terrible as this pandemic has been, I guess one silver lining is that now, with everything being online, we're able to connect and communicate with one another in new ways, which I really think is important as we enter into this necessary, difficult, and often uncomfortable work of examining and addressing long-standing issues of race and racism in our church and in our broader society. I do have a slideshow, so let me go ahead and put that up on the screen. There we go. So kind of dovetailing with the conversation about racial identity, I think when people look at me, they often have a hard time identifying my race. So I kind of jokingly say that I'm ambiguously ethnic. Not really white, but we're not quite sure what you are. So growing up, I'd get a lot of those roundabout questions like, where are you from? And I'd say, well, I was born and raised in Virginia. Okay, but where are you from? Or where are your people from? You know, I'll never forget this one time while I was working as a chaplain at a prison in Louisiana. One of the guards, who I'd known for a while, kind of pulled me aside and said to me, hey chap, can I ask you a question? Sure. So are you some kind of Mexican or something? And I said, well, no, my dad is from Korea. So you're a Chinaman? My dad is from Korea. Wow, I never would have guessed that. You don't look like no Chinaman. At which point I just kind of sighed and said, well, it's the beard, it throws people off. So I've, kind of grown up having to navigate through these kind of complicated issues of racial identity and the way that that's kind of projected and imposed on me. So yes, my dad did move here from Korea in the 70s to go to graduate school at UCLA. where he met my mother, and that's my mom in the picture there at their wedding, who is of Irish, Dutch, and English descent, or in other words, here in America, we would say she's white. Now it's, I guess, kind of funny. My father actually is one of the people that might fit that stereotype behind the problematic Asian model minority myth. And one might see his story as actually an example of the very few people who can actually realize the so-called American dream. So my dad grew up very poor in war-torn Korea. And sometimes he would tell stories about how his family had to flee into the mountains during the fighting, and they would forage for food, and he would have to do things like catch bugs to have something to eat. But he didn't complain. He worked really hard. He studied and did well in school. He came to the US, worked his way through graduate school, earned a PhD, and was highly successful in his career working for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And in that career, he won all kinds of impressive accolades and awards. So last night I just Google searched his name, and there's my dad there, who's won a Service to America Medal for his work. And it wasn't until later as an adult, I had this moment of realization, actually at my father's retirement party. So I'm standing around eating puff pastries, kind of hobnobbing with all these high-ranking government officials. And I had this realization that, wow, my dad grew up eating bugs. And here I am in a fancy suit eating puff pastries. My quality of life growing up was vastly different from his. Now, I should also say that my mother also came from very humble beginnings in a family with very little money or resources, but she also worked hard through school, earned a PhD. She was a college professor and a high school teacher, and for many years, a loving and attentive stay-at-home mom. So my siblings and I grew up with all kinds of opportunities, privileges, and other forms of assistance that my parents never had, and that sadly many people in our country still don't have. Never in my life have I had to worry about whether I'd have enough to eat, or whether I'd have clothing to wear, or a place to live. I've never been without health insurance. So whenever I've been sick or injured, it wasn't a question about whether I should go see the doctor because I couldn't afford the expense. I had highly educated parents who helped me with my homework, paid my way through college, and continued to encourage and support me in different ways when I was a struggling graduate student and when I was going through that sort of disorienting time of discerning a call to ministry. And so there I am as a younger, fresh-faced seminarian at my first parish in Louisiana. It's a beautiful historic church kind of on the banks of the Mississippi. Now, I'm saying this about my family because on the one hand, I have to admit, and I believe, the American dream that pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work hard, and provide a better life for your children is not impossible, but I also recognize that it's highly improbable. So what my parents accomplished is exceptional, which is to say, not the norm, statistically unlikely. It's an outlier case. But I'm also aware that these kind of rare and unusual stories of success like my father's are often used to support a popular fantasy about upward mobility, that all you really need to do is work hard, no matter who you are or where you're from. With enough grit and determination, you can pull yourself up and out of poverty into a comfortable upper middle class life. Now, kind of implied in that argument, in turn, we might say it stands to reason then that people who are poor and working class aren't really trapped in poverty and menial servitude. Rather, they're only stuck where they are in life because they're lazy and ignorant, which simply isn't true. Now, I'm grateful for what I've been given in life. I didn't earn any of the advantages my parents provided for me. And I recognize that because of what my parents accomplished through their hard work, suffering, and toil, it has been much easier for me to get to where I am today. talking to all of you online about racial capitalism. So what does race have to do with capitalism? I'm going to start with just a little ground clearing. So there's this great quote by the 19th century French scholar Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote, "Americans combine the notions of Christianity and of liberty," by which he means democracy, "so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive the one without the other." I think the same can be said about Christianity and capitalism in the minds of many Americans today. That the two have become so intertwined in our collective sense of identity that it almost seems impossible to conceive of one without the other. It's almost as if capitalism and capitalist ideology has become sacrosanct in the American imagination, such that criticizing or saying anything negative about capitalism is regarded as blasphemy or treated as heresy. But as Christians, as members of the Jesus movement, which has been around for a couple thousand years, long before the emergence of capitalism, we have to be able to recognize that it's possible to be Christian without being a capitalist, and that we can, in fact, conceptually separate one from the other, Christianity from capitalism, and that the two don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. And I think it's important for us to be able to do that if we're going to take seriously and consider the position of a growing number of scholars and public intellectuals who argue that capitalism and racism are fundamentally connected. Meaning that if we really want to examine and address the problems of racism and racial inequity in our society today, we need to be able to think critically about how our current global capitalist economy came to be and arguably continues to function. So what is the relationship between Christianity and capitalism? Many contemporary theorists who talk about racial capitalism, like UCLA professor Robin Kelley, are quick to point out that racial capitalism is not simply I'm sorry, I got behind on my slides there. So there's a sign at a protest that says you can't have capitalism without racism. The two are fundamentally intertwined. And here's the quote from Robin Kelley: "Racial capitalism is not simply a type of capitalism, as opposed to, say, non-racist or non-racial capitalism. There is no such thing as non-racial capitalism. It doesn't exist. It only exists in the minds of economists who themselves are thinking in racial terms." So when considering this fundamental connection between capitalism, racialization, and racism, we don't need to assume that the relationship is necessarily one of causation, that capitalism is somehow the cause of racism. Rather, to borrow a helpful concept from the 20th century German sociologist Max Weber, I'd suggest the relationship is one of an elective affinity, meaning a relationship of reciprocal attraction and influence, mutual selection, active convergence, and mutual reinforcement. So Weber used this term to talk about the sort of symbiotic relationship between Protestantism and capitalism, which both emerged and developed together at the same time in Europe. And I think this concept of a kind of a mutually reinforcing relationship can be said about racism, racialization, and capitalism. That though one is not necessarily the cause of the other, they do share an elective affinity with one another. How so? Well, in a nutshell, the argument goes something like this. And this is from Jody Melamed, a professor of English and Africana Studies at Marquette University. Capital can only be capital when it is accumulating. And it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Racism enshrines those inequalities, the inequalities that capitalism requires. In other words, at its very foundations, the operative engine of capitalism is the drive to continually accumulate. Accumulate and produce, produce and accumulate and produce. And that only really works, only succeeds in a free market within systems and structures of inequity and exploitation among different human groups. And racism helps preserve and codify and legitimate these systemic structures and relationships of inequity and exploitation, which are needed for capitalism to thrive. Now, I know at this point, some people will want to object and say, well, that's not true. I also sort of realize that if you're tuning into this webinar, there might be a good chance that you don't see a problem here. Maybe what I'm saying sounds fairly basic and obvious to you, but we also have to recognize that that's not going to be the case for many of the people in our pews who won't easily see or accept this connection, who will insist that there's nothing inherent to capitalism that requires exploitation and racial inequity. And to that objection, I'd say, maybe. I suppose it's theoretically possible to envision such a form of non-racial capitalism, but that's a kind of theoretical form of capitalism that only exists in the minds of economists, as Robin Kelly says, who themselves are perhaps unknowingly often thinking in racialized terms. When you look at the actual reality and history of how our current global capitalist economy came to be, evolving and expanding through conquest, colonization, dispossession, slavery, and let us not forget, environmental destruction, the connection seems fairly straightforward. Now, of course, we all know that conquest, colonization, dispossession, slavery have been around a long time before the emergence of capitalism. The prejudicial view and exploitation and oppression of people regarded as other is certainly nothing new. Just think about the word barbarian, which is from the ancient Greek barbaros, meaning foreign, strange, ignorant, which actually comes from an onomatopoeia, a word barbar, which they said was the sound that foreigners sound like when they're speaking in their unintelligible speech. This is actually what the Greeks thought the Persians sounded like when they were talking. Bar, 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 bar. We don't know what they're saying, so we just call them barbars, barbarians, barbaros. It's basically the ancient equivalent of contemporary English speakers saying ching chong to mock the language and people of East Asia. Now, we read our Bibles, and so we also know that slavery has also been around for a long time. I mean, we retell the story every year about how God heard the cries of God's people, the Israelite slaves in Egypt, and delivered them from bondage. And we also know, I mean, simply from reading the Bible, that slavery and oppression don't stop with the Egyptians. They continue in the empires of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Hellenists, and of course, the Romans. Now, each of these empires justified their practices of conquest, colonization, dispossession, and slavery as not only being acceptable, but good and right, divinely sanctioned by the will of the gods. Look, the Greeks and Romans didn't think of themselves as oppressive conquerors, but as beacons of enlightenment, bringing the light of civilization and culture and reason and peace to the rest of the barbarian world. We will share with them the Pax Romana, the peace of the Roman Empire. But think about this from the perspective of the people they're conquering. So there's another great quote from a speech which is purportedly given by one of the barbarian chieftains of the clans in Britain, who has this to say about the Romans. To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a wasteland and call it peace. Now, this may seem like a bit of a non sequitur. I like to take, historical detours through ancient history, but I do find it interesting that you see in the imagination of early Americans, there was this sense of a deep connection with ancient Rome. Just look at the writings of the so-called founding fathers. They were enamored with the ancient Romans. When you look at the way they talked about what they were trying to accomplish with this new nation, in their mind, this nation and society that they were helping to create would be modeled in many ways after the ideals and practices of ancient Rome. And you can see this in their love of classic ancient architecture. So this on the left there, that's the rotunda at my alma mater, the University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson, intentionally modeled after the Pantheon in Rome. And so that on the right, there's the picture of the ancient Pantheon in Rome. So they wanted to model a new nation and society after the ideals and practices of ancient Rome. And to a certain extent, I think that's actually true, but not really a good thing when we view it from the perspective of the people affected by American conquest. When we look at the history of Western civilization, it's easy to see the shadow side of imperial ideology. And in our own nation's history, it seems fairly plain that we have a shameful past of robbery, slaughter, and plunder, of laying waste to entire civilizations and people groups and calling it peace, So from the rotunda, this actually is a memorial that was just put up near the rotunda at the University of Virginia, recognizing the enslaved laborers who helped build the University of Virginia and whose labor was used in servitude there in the university's early years. So the memorial was, construction was completed in April 2020, and there on the right, you can see it provided a, I think, appropriate place for a gathering and protest following the horrible murder of George Floyd. The campus was actually closed at that point because of COVID, but these are all the doctors you can see from the local hospital there coming out to kneel at the memorial. So I know that the Reverend Canon Mary Christ has already spoken a lot about these topics in her presentation on the Doctrine of Discovery and recognizing the limitations of time. Bishop Bruce did remind me when we did our run through that this is supposed to be an introduction. Just give them don't tell them everything, just give them a taste of what we'll cover in future conversations. But sometimes when I get going, it's hard to stop. So in any case, in what time I have left, allow me to finish painting this picture with some broad brushstrokes. So returning to our topic of racial capitalism and its historic foundations, racialization and racism doesn't begin with capitalism, but capitalism does develop and operate within racist systems and racial regimes. So in the way the story goes, capitalism begins, and capital itself doesn't begin with money, but with what economic theorists call primitive accumulation or primitive capital, which begins with the seizing of control of natural resources, land, water, fuel, combined with the exploitation of cheap or unfree labor to turn those resources into commodities. So with the expansion of Atlantic and Asian trade routes in the imagination of European imperialists, much like their ancient counterparts, they saw the rest of the world, that world beyond Europe, as a world inhabited by savages and barbarians, whose labor and land was just there for the taking. And this was not only justified, but sanctioned by God, because they were bringing the light of civilization and culture and reason and true religion, right? I love what Canon Mary Christ said, that you can't have the Great Commission without the Great Commandment. And yet we know in our American context that, I mean, those two were not held together. And the broad appeal of colonization, people wanting to come to America, was this idea that here's a new world, untouched, meaning not yet pillaged by Europeans, with bountiful land, resources, and free labor, just there for the taking. The conscription and exploitation of the indigenous people groups was there at the beginning. We know that Christopher Columbus in his journals, on the day he first encountered the indigenous peoples here in America, wrote in his journal, "They will make good slaves. They don't know anything about weapons. I handed this guy my sword and he cut himself. It will only take 50 men to subjugate all of them and force them to do what we want." Now, the practice of exploiting the resources and labor of these racially differentiated people groups evolves into the practice of chattel slavery with the importation of stolen people from Africa. Now, in our kind of high school history textbooks, if you take that narrative, we might like to think that slavery was something limited to the South, unrelated to the growth of commerce and industry in the North. And it was an antiquated means of production that would have been phased out anyway with future industrial innovations. That's been a kind of a popular argument for many years, but historians today argue that that's really not true at all. That the expansive growth and power of the American economy and industry was really only made possible by slavery, specifically those slaves who were forced to pick cotton. So this is a book that came out not too long ago by Edward Baptist, who writes that between the 1790s and the 1820s, the United States acquired a near monopoly on cotton, the world's most widely traded commodity. And cotton drove US expansion, enabling our young country to grow from a narrow coastal belt into a vast, powerful nation with the fastest growing economy in the world. Now, after the Civil War, with the end of slavery in America, well, at least that kind of slavery, we know that racism, oppression, and subjugation don't simply go away, but rather they just take on different forms. Following the collapse of Reconstruction, we can see the emergence of a series of state-sanctioned policies and practices put in place that preserve economic disparity between racialized groups, that oppress and subjugate Black and other non-white peoples, and who are necessary to continue to supply the cheap labor required for the engine of capitalism to keep going, accumulating and producing, accumulating and producing, producing and accumulating. Now, I can't go through all of these things, but just to kind of give you a sampling and a taste of things that we could look at of these state-sanctioned practices and policies. I mean, from the beginning, there's racial terrorism, lynching, and then Jim Crow and segregation laws. Later, we have practices such as redlining, which prevented people in predominantly Black neighborhoods from obtaining federally backed mortgages because they were deemed too risky, and effectively kept Black families from actually being able to grow equity and own their homes. There's the disparity in the way that the GI Bill was awarded between veterans who were Black and veterans who were white, where pretty much anybody who was white and a veteran could apply for a GI Bill and use that federally backed guaranteed loan to buy a farm or a home or a business. Whereas a very, very small number of Black veterans who applied actually received the award of the GI Bill. So there were millions who could have and yet did not. And we also have to think about the economic or the educational disparity in terms of quality and access to education, which actually, it doesn't end with desegregation. Because with the desegregation of public schools, that's immediately followed by a widespread growth of very expensive private schools, which effectively meant that all the students would be white because those were the families that could afford tuition. And many of those schools were run by churches, including our own. And finally, something else that we might want to think about when we begin to consider our own contemporary context in this globalized economy, maybe we should ask how much of the manufacturing and production for American companies is performed overseas, where labor is cheap. There's little to no requirement to provide those extra expensive benefits like healthcare and retirement or safe working conditions. And to what extent do the raw materials and natural resources utilized in our commodities, to what extent do those come from areas of the world where the exploitation and use of coerced labor is widespread, where there is little regard for the environmental impact of resource extraction? So just one example, a large amount of the rare earth minerals used in our consumer electronics, you know, the laptop I'm using, the phone that's in front of me, the rare earth minerals needed for those electronics come from mining operations like this one depicted in these pictures from the Congo. And here at home, oops, I got ahead of myself. Here at home, we also can't ignore, and we should really think about the fact that we continue to import migrant labor to operate our farms and agricultural industries and other domestic services. Now, much more can be said about these and other topics, but with what time I have left, I want to talk about a subject that's close to me and I'm personally familiar with, and that is mass incarceration. So works that have come out in the last decade or so, and these recent works like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Douglas Blackmun's Slavery by Another Name, and the Netflix documentary 13th, and there are plenty of other works too, that do a great job of showing a direct line of connection between slavery and mass incarceration, that kind of show how involuntary servitude, slavery, didn't actually end with the Civil War. It simply took on a different form. How the prison industrial complex functions to reinforce racial inequity in America and maintain the subjugation of marginalized people, especially Black and brown people, under the guise of justice. And all the while, not only have private companies continued to profit from forms of state-sanctioned human labor trafficking, but public government agencies as well have become utterly dependent on unfree prison labor for their day-to-day operations. So I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I worked for a time as a chaplain at a prison in Louisiana, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is popularly known as Angola. And at Angola, it's actually really easy to trace the connection from slavery to the prison, because Angola was itself a slave plantation before the Civil War. There was a different facility in Baton Rouge called the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but at Angola, after the Civil War, the plantation owner, with no more slaves to work his plantation, made a deal with the state to lease the convicts. So essentially, he said, I'll provide them room and board in exchange for their labor. And he just moved the convicts right into the old slave quarters. Soon he was able to expand his operations to be able to subcontract this forced prison labor out of his plantation into other local plantations, and then started taking on government work because he was able to win contracts because he could underbid his competitors. He didn't have to pay a workforce. And so these prisoners ended up in Louisiana building much of the levees up and down the Mississippi. They installed railroads throughout the state. And during this era of convict leasing, conditions were actually arguably worse for the prisoners than they had been in the past for slaves, because plantation owners had no long-term incentives to preserve the life of their laborers. With the growing promulgation of these kind of ridiculous laws forbidding things like vagrancy, mischief, insulting gestures, which were only ever used to criminalize recently freed Black men, with the promulgation of these laws, there was a never-ending supply of new prisoners who could replace the old ones who were literally being worked to death. You go back and look at the records, there's hundreds of deaths every year at Angola from people just working past the point of exhaustion. Now, when the state of Louisiana took over the plantation in the early 1900s, it was actually for purely economic reasons. The argument was that this plantation owner is making money that the state should get because those convicts belong to us. They're our property. We own them, and we should receive the benefits of their labor. And to this day, the Louisiana State Penitentiary is still a fully operational 18,000-acre farm. So this is kind of an overview satellite view. It's kind of hard to see, but those circles are the different camps where within the plantation grounds where inmates are housed. And today it houses over 6,300 inmates, maximum security prison. Everyone there has to work because they're sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. So if they're physically able, they have to work. And the only way to get out of work is to get in trouble, get thrown into solitary confinement. So that's kind of a satellite view. This is what the prison camp looks like. And there you can see the Mississippi River. The prison grounds are sort of surrounded on three sides by the river. Most of the men are housed in these sort of military style barracks, about 90 men to a barracks in these bunk beds, which is way more than the buildings were initially designed for. And these are the farm lines going out to work the farms. And they're accompanied in the front and the back by armed guards on horses. So prison labor is still used to operate the farm, and it's also subcontracted out to local businesses and companies. And the prisoners are only really making 10 or 25 cents an hour in exchange for their labor. But one of the things that really shocked me, it's not really a secret, but it's not often discussed, that in Louisiana, almost all the government buildings and agencies use prison labor. So for example, in the state capitol building, it's inmates who do all the maintenance and janitorial work, who staff the cafeteria and do the groundskeeping. The state police are themselves dependent on prison labor to keep their operations running, because all the squad cars or the vehicles are maintained by prisoners. The police training center is itself staffed by inmates who maintain the grounds. They clean up the shooting range. They do a lot of the paperwork. The governor's mansion is staffed by prisoners, and not just for maintenance and groundskeeping, but there's a butler and a private chef. And I heard this from one of the guys who used to work at the governor's mansion. I'm not sure if it's actually true, but he said that Bobby Jindal conscripted inmates to make dresses and leather handbags for his wife. So as much as politicians may like to talk about being tough on crime, fighting a war on drugs, and ending crime in our neighborhoods, the fact of the matter is, if they actually won that war and stopped crime, the institutions of government wouldn't be able to function. With no more unfree labor to do all the work, the system would stop. And this is a systemic issue because the system no longer works without a steady input of new prisoners. So there's a financial disincentive to reduce rates of incarceration because of the way the system itself is structured and organized. This is, we know this is certainly the case also for private for-profit prisons, and there's a lot more I could say about that. But I guess what's surprising to me is that it's also the case in public or state-run prisons and penitentiaries. And if you want to think that Louisiana is an outlier, this kind of exploitation of prison labor is not limited to Louisiana, but it's more or less like this all over the country. And so I'm not as familiar with California, but I kind of looked it up, and in California, it has always been the case that prison labor has been utilized to provide goods and services to state agencies, making things like office furniture, clothing, and license plates. And then in 1990, California passed Proposition 139, also known as the Prison Inmate Labor Initiative. And that proposition amended the state constitution to allow private businesses to utilize prison labor. And I'd have to think and look more into it, but I don't think, I mean, it's maybe not a coincidence that at the same time in the early 1990s, that's the time when prison populations across the country were beginning to explode with new tough on crime policies and mandatory minimum sentencing requirements like the 3 strikes law. So as prison populations began to expand, the state also passes a new bill saying, and we can use their labor not only for public work, but for private industry. In any case, now in California, there are many manufacturing and electronic companies that use prison labor that only pay minimum wage with no benefits, and the state actually takes 60% of that pay. The prisoner only actually receives at the time of his or her work their earnings of 20%, and then the state says, well, we're going to hang on to the other 20%, and we'll give that to you upon your release. So the state, I mean, the company is paying minimum wage, but the state takes 60%, and what's only really immediately accessible to the prisoner is 20% at the time of their work. I could talk for days. Once you get me talking about prison stuff, I can go on for a long time. But I do want to end by bringing this back around to the church and our church. So this is my first parish again, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, which is in Ennis. And this is a plaque that's just inside the door, which kind of floored me when I first walked in. It's founded in 1848. The building is the first solid brick edifice in Point Coupee Parish, built with handmade brick and slave labor. Consecrated in 1859 by Bishop Leonidas Polk, later a Confederate general. So I guess I think at the end, you know, after going through this long history and looking at these kind of really troubling and problematic systemic issues in our society, I think for us in the church, this is now a time for an examination of our conscience, to really consider our past and ask, to what extent has our church been built by slave labor? And I'm not just talking about the actual buildings, but the wealth and equity we have inherited, the healthy and hefty endowments that keep many of our cardinal parishes going. Where did that wealth come from? And was it produced in and through racial capitalist systems that depend on relations of inequity and exploitation of different groups of people? And if that really is the case, what are we going to do about it? And that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Peter, I just wanted to thank you for your presentation and all the quantity and quality of information that you presented to us today. It gives us much to think about, especially how it relates to ourselves, our churches, and the economies that we participate with. I like how you've teased out how capitalism is not the cause of racism, but how they are so intrinsically related. And there seems to be something there too, I think, about competition and what is healthy competition, meaning maybe competition that's not at the, or for the sake of, you know, people's humanity. But I think at the end, you give us something really important to think about, asking the question about our churches as to where the position that we enjoy, where does it come from? And maybe another question for everyone else as to what now can we do with it? And I wonder if you could comment to that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I appreciate the comments and the questions. I have to think more about the issues you raise, especially about competition and to what extent can that be healthy? You know, because I think part of the premise of sort of capitalist ideology is that you know, you let the free market do what it will, and competition will bring out the best in industry. We can actually grow through the struggle and striving against one another, which sounds nice. I'm just concerned that, you know, in a market that's driven solely by competition without any kind of oversight or regulation, just trusting the free hand of the economy, it seems like in such, that's a system that's sort of set up to allow for exploitation, because if I can get this product made by someone I'm only paying 10 cents an hour, and you're going to pay someone a living wage, I win the competition. If the competition is the accumulation of capital and wealth, the continuous production and accumulation of capital. And I think theologically speaking, I'm not sure how much within our Christian ethos, competition with one another really is viewed as a virtue. When you look at the story in those first chapters of Acts, the early Christian community, the means of distribution wasn't, to the person who works the hardest or the person who merits the most, but they pulled together their resources and gave to each according to their need, recognizing that some people might not work as much or produce as much, and they need more. But as a Christian community that cares for the least of these, it's hard for me to see how competition, even though we want to think of it as a virtue, actually fits into that, what it means to be a follower of Christ. And you had asked some other things, but I think Peter's got a comment.
Well, thank you, Peter and Nick, even especially bringing this back to competition. And I want to just reflect on the American dream too, that this white picket fence, house with a yard, 2.5 kids. If we're not discerning enough, we might not recognize that oftentimes the American dream is a very white dream. And it's also a very capitalistic dream. And the American dream can't assume exploitation, that money and resources are a limited commodity that we need to compete for. So I appreciate the focus on that competition, and also that's really not quite how our faith works. Faith is not a zero-sum proposition, and where more for one is less of another. God does not work like that. And at the heart of God and at the heart of our faith is not competition, but liberation and love. And I think part of what we're talking about today in all three presentations is to emphasize that. I think closer to home, I want to just reflect briefly on Asian Pacific American perspective, that oftentimes we find ourselves on both sides of racial capitalism. And Peter, you described your own experience, your father's experience. And I think especially as East Asians, I think it's important to call out that we are often white until we're not, and I remember my father-in-law, who worked in the 70s in Texas, was told to use the white drinking fountain, and he's Chinese American, and to use the white bathroom. And oftentimes as Asian Americans, we pursue the American dream and align with whiteness and are complicit with that. What does it take to succeed? And perhaps even take on an unconscious white supremacist view. But we are also exploited, conveniently told not to belong. Monterey Park, for example, is not flushed with Asian Pacific Americans because it's the awesome place to be, but because it was one of the first cities that allowed for Asian Americans to purchase, to buy homes. And we saw this in the LA uprising in 1992. Korean Americans and Black Americans pitted against each other, and colonized people at odds with each other on the wrong side of redlining. The fires kept burning and the unrest kept going. But it wasn't until the unrest reached closer to Beverly Hills that police stepped in. So was that a racial thing, or was that an economic thing? So I think for us, this question of what do we do as a church is really relevant. how do we create a system that is more just? How do Christians help create something that's more just for everyone? Not just loving each other, but as our presiding bishop says, life-giving and liberating love of God really is the heart of our gospel message. So I leave us with this question too. What is the work that we, the church, would need to do? And so there's certainly a lot more to explore, but I'm really appreciative of engaging this part of our racial conversations.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Kenna McCarthy, could you put up the slide about the future dates, please? I want to thank the new community leadership again, Suzanne Edwards-Acton, John Limo, Mary Christ, Penny Chang, Carlos Rubalcaba, Peter Huang, Connie Horniak, Nick Griffith, Yane Kim, Aidan Coe, Brent Keenis, Gail Kawahara, and Kushnud Azariah. And I'd like to thank our special guest presenters, Erica Bertling and Peter Kong. I also want to thank Canon Melissa McCarthy for her incredible tech support today, and a big and mighty thank you to our interpreter, Ada Ramirez. I sincerely hope that I see you all at our next event as we talk in deeper terms, believe it or not, about these three topics. And I'd now like to invite John Limo to close us with a prayer.
Thank you very much for unmuting me. I had to change gadgets because the computer went off. I would like us to pray at this moment. Pray. Heavenly Father, trauma and untruths in your name. We are a people you created in many traditions, many political parties, many cultures. We are poor and rich, women and men, young and old, gay and straight. We are appealing to you to come with us as we struggle to emerge from strife and death to seek a future of life and health. We acknowledge the presence of Christ among us, who reconciles the world. We are struggling against one another, but we seek to reconcile, to be reconciled, to struggle for one another. We have believed it is right to withstand one another. Now we are seeking to be reconciled and understand one another. We have endured the power of violence, but now we seek reconciliation to the power of tolerance. Some of us have built irreconcilable barriers between us, but now we seek to build a society of reconciliation. Some of us believe that they alone hold the truth, but now we seek reconciliation. That truth holds all of us. Give us grace to discern that the earth belongs to you and we are stewards of it. Give us grace to seek your way for all of us. So we bring together our races, languages, traditions, politics, and cultures under God. We seek to be reconciled to the patience and persistence that make peace, to the transparency and fairness that make justice, to the forgiveness and restitution that build harmony, to the love and reconstruction which banish poverty and discrimination, to the experience of knowing one another that make it possible to enjoy one another, to the spiritual strength of the one God who made us one flesh and one blood and loves us all. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Again, thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you at any one of the future events. This has been recorded and will be up on the diocesan website, along with copies of the presentations. Please invite your congregation, your family, your friends to come along with us on this journey as we dig deeper into our future together. Thank you.